Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into limerence.
Oh, yeah,
You've
limerence.
probably seen it all over online lately, right?
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Makes you wonder, like, have I felt this?
Right.
What is it really?
Yeah,
We're going way past those, you know, quick little definitions you see on social media
definitely.
to really get what limerence is all about.
For sure.
So we've got this
Yeah.
awesome writing that really digs into limerence, its causes, symptoms, even some potential solutions.
Sounds good.
I'm so glad to have our expert here to walk us through it all.
Happy to be here. It's pretty interesting to see limerence getting so much attention these days.
Yeah, sure.
But it's not actually a new thing, you know?
Really?
Psychologist Dorothy Tenev actually came up with the term
Oh, wow.
way back in the 70s.
I had no idea.
Her book, Love and Limerence, The Experience of Being in Love.
Okay, so before we get too deep into it all, can you give us like a clear idea of what limerence actually is? Like, how is it different from just having, a big crush?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
A crush is usually pretty light and fleeting, you know?
Hmm.
But limerence is much more intense
Oh,
and
wow.
all-consuming.
Got it.
Tenev described it as this involuntary state of mind
Okay.
where you fixate on having your feelings reciprocated by a specific person.
Mm.
It goes way beyond those, like, butterfly feelings.
Wow.
It's intrusive thoughts, longing, real dependence on the other person.
So it's definitely more than just like a little crush, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Some people call it like love addiction.
Right.
Is that accurate?
That's a term that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
And it does kind of capture that intensity of limerence.
Okay.
But it's important to remember it's not an official addiction clinically.
Got it.
The real difference from love is that limerence often comes from fantasy and projection
Oh, interesting.
rather than, a real unbalanced connection.
Makes sense. I'm already starting to see how this can become kind of tricky.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why someone might experience limerence
Sure.
in the first place.
Yeah.
Our source talks about 5 main causes.
Mhm.
I'm really curious to hear more about them.
Absolutely. Understanding these root causes is so important for breaking free from limerence
Yeah, that makes sense.
if it's, causing problems in your life.
Totally.
So let's start with childhood emotional neglect.
Okay.
Imagine growing up in an environment where your emotional needs weren't consistently met.
Oh, so you might start looking for that validation in your relationships later on.
Exactly. Limerence can actually feel familiar to someone who experienced that kind of neglect
Interesting.
because it kind of mirrors that childhood dynamic,
Oh, okay.
that craving for attention and recognition.
So it's like they're subconsciously trying to recreate those patterns to finally get what they were missing as a kid.
Yeah, it can be like that.
Oh, that's kind of sad.
It can be. And often what comes with that emotional neglect is this reliance on fantasy
Oh, I see.
as a way of coping.
Right, right.
They might create these elaborate scenarios in their head with the person they're focused on,
Right.
like picturing perfect dates or grand gestures. It's a way to escape how they feel and fill that emotional void.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a powerful pull,
Right.
escaping into a fantasy world.
Definitely.
So what about the next cause on the list? Insecure attachment styles.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard a lot about those lately, but
Mhm.
can you explain how they connect to limerence?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Insecure attachment often comes from inconsistent emotional care during childhood.
right.
And it can definitely show up as limerence.
Okay.
Imagine someone with an anxious attachment style.
Mm,
They're terrified of being rejected.
I get it.
So they cling to this idea of an idealized relationship.
It's like a way to avoid being alone.
Exactly. And then you have someone with an avoidant attachment style. They actually might find comfort in the distance inherent in limerence.
Really?
Yeah, it allows them to experience the fantasy of love
Interesting.
without the vulnerability of real intimacy.
So both of those attachment styles are trying to protect themselves from getting hurt, just
Yeah.
in totally different ways.
Right, yeah.
Now, what about disorganized attachment?
Mm.
How did that fit in?
Disorganized attachment can be a little more complicated.
Okay.
For people with this style, limerence might be a way to seek safety in a fantasy world
I see.
where they can avoid the complexities of trust and closeness,
Yeah.
which can be really difficult for them.
It seems like we're seeing a theme here.
Definitely.
Those early childhood experiences really have a lasting impact on our relationships
For sure.
later in life.
Absolutely.
So now our source also mentions childhood trauma
Right.
as a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that connection?
Of course, childhood trauma, whether it's abuse, neglect, or other forms of harm,
Yeah.
can create a deep sense of emptiness within a person. Okay.
They might really long for someone to fill that void,
Right.
but struggle to form healthy relationships.
Because of that fear of getting hurt again.
Exactly. Limerence becomes a way to love from a distance.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's a defense mechanism, but it can end up being really painful.
Absolutely, because it's not grounded in reality.
Right.
Now, this might surprise you,
Okay.
but our source also connects limerence to OCD.
Really? Wow, I never would have thought of that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
How does that work?
Well, think about the core elements of limerence.
Mm-hmm.
You have those obsessive thoughts about a specific person,
Mm-hmm.
and then you might do things almost compulsively to get their attention
Yeah.
or try to make them feel the same way about you.
Oh, that's true.
And that actually aligns pretty closely with the symptoms of OCD.
Someone experiencing limerence might, constantly check the other person's social media or replay interactions in their head over and over.
Exactly.
Then always be trying to run into them.
Yeah, it can be all-consuming. It's starting to make sense why we're hearing so much about limerence these days.
Mm,
So many people struggle with OCD that hasn't been diagnosed.
right.
And maybe this is one way it shows up in
It
relationships.
could be.
Okay, that's 4 causes down. What's the 5th one?
The last one is the connection between limerence and borderline personality disorder.
Okay, BPD, another one I'm curious about.
Yeah.
How does limerence play a role in that?
For people with BPD, limerence can actually make their fears of abandonment even worse. That intense infatuation and constant daydreaming
Right.
can lead them to believe the relationship is much more real and reciprocal than it actually is.
It's like they build this whole world in their head,
Exactly.
and the lines between fantasy and reality get all blurred.
Yeah, and then because of that intense fear of abandonment,
Mm-hmm.
they cling really desperately to the relationship,
Right.
even when it's clearly not healthy or sustainable.
That sounds really painful.
It can be a tough cycle.
Well, we've covered some pretty heavy stuff here.
We have.
But I think it's so important to understand these underlying causes of limerence
Definitely.
if we want to help people break free from these patterns.
I agree. By understanding those roots, we can approach limerence with compassion
Right.
and start exploring effective solutions.
Let's get into those, but before we do,
That's right.
I think it's important to talk about how to even recognize limerence in the first place.
Sure.
Are there any, warning signs we should be looking out for?
There are definitely some red flags that can indicate someone might be experiencing limerence.
Okay, let's hear them.
All right, well, one of the biggest ones is falling for someone really fast and hard,
Got it.
even if you haven't had a lot of real interaction with them.
Like those whirlwind romances you see in the movies.
Yes, exactly, but, amplified.
Okay.
And with that comes, constant daydreaming about this person.
Mhm.
You might replay little encounters in your mind,
Oh, yeah.
embellish them, imagine entire scenarios that haven't even happened.
So you're basically living in a fantasy world.
Pretty much, rather than engaging with the reality of the situation.
And because you've built this, idealized image of them,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to see any flaws or red flags.
Quite precisely. You might even explain away any negative behavior or warning signs.
Ugh, I've totally been there.
Yeah.
It's like you're wearing rose-colored glasses and you just refuse to take them off.
Right. And another big sign of limerence is that intense focus on whether or not they feel the same way about you.
Yeah.
It's not just about having feelings for someone. It's that desperate longing for them to reciprocate.
So it's like your whole happiness hinges on whether they like you back.
Yeah, and that can lead to some pretty unhealthy behaviors.
Definitely.
People caught in limerence might constantly check the other person's social media,
Oh, yeah.
try to orchestrate chance encounters,
I see.
analyze every little interaction for signs of reciprocation.
It's a constant quest for validation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's even more concerning is that they might start to believe this person holds the key to their happiness or can somehow solve all their problems.
It's like they're putting this huge burden on the other person,
Exactly, often without even realizing it.
especially if the feelings aren't mutual.
Right.
Speaking of that, our source mentions that people experiencing limerence have a really hard time moving on,
Yeah,
even when it's clear the other person isn't interested.
that's right. They might know intellectually that the situation isn't healthy or realistic,
Right.
but they still feel this overwhelming pull toward the other person.
It's almost like an addiction.
Yeah, kind of like we were talking about earlier.
So what can someone do if they see these signs in themselves? Is there any hope for breaking free from this, limerence trap?
There absolutely is.
you.
Our source outlines some strategies for overcoming limerence.
Yep.
And like we said earlier, self-awareness is the first step.
Yeah, you can't fix something if you don't know it's broken.
Exactly. You have to be willing to look at your life and admit that you're struggling with limerence. Then, depending on those root causes we discussed,
Okay.
you can start addressing them.
Makes sense.
If trauma is a factor, therapies like EMDR or somatic experiencing can be super helpful.
So you're basically retraining your brain to react differently to certain triggers and emotions.
That's a great way to put it. And if someone's struggling with insecure attachment,
Yeah.
working on building secure attachment skills can be really transformative.
I've heard a lot about those lately.
Yeah.
But can you give us like a quick rundown of what that kind of work looks like?
It often involves looking back at those early attachment experiences
Okay.
that shaped your current relationship patterns.
Mm-hmm.
You can start to understand how those experiences are influencing your behavior
I see.
and learn new ways to communicate and connect with others in a healthier way.
That sounds like it could be really helpful.
It can be. Our source also talks about the importance of challenging your thoughts.
Okay. How does that work?
It's about questioning those idealized fantasies you've created about the other person. Are those fantasies based in reality, or are you projecting qualities onto them that might not actually be there?
So taking a step back and asking yourself, is this really true, or am I getting carried away?
Exactly. And finally, there's emotional regulation.
Okay.
This is crucial because limerence is such an emotionally intense experience.
I get that, but what does emotional regulation actually look like?
It's all about building up your resilience and learning how to handle those intense feelings in a healthy way.
Right?
It could involve things like self-care techniques, getting enough sleep,
Okay.
eating a balanced diet,
Got it.
exercising regularly,
Mm-hmm.
or practicing mindfulness.
Those all make sense.
It's also about having a good support system in place
Yeah.
and learning healthy ways to cope when those intense emotions come up.
So building a strong foundation so you can weather those emotional storms.
Exactly. And remember, limerence isn't a life sentence.
That's good to hear.
With the right tools and support,
Yeah.
it's totally possible to move beyond it and build relationships grounded in reality, mutuality, and real connection.
That's a really hopeful message. It makes me think, are there any positive aspects to limerence?
Good question.
I know it can be a problem,
Yeah.
but can those intense feelings ever lead to something good?
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
While limerence can definitely cause a lot of heartache and disruption,
Mm-hmm.
I do think there can be some silver linings.
Okay, like what?
Well, for example, it can be a powerful motivator.
How so?
Think about all that energy and focus that goes into pursuing the object of your affection.
Yeah, it's like you suddenly have this drive you didn't have before.
Exactly. That energy can be channeled into creative things or even personal growth.
Okay.
You might find yourself taking on new challenges, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone,
Interesting.
even learning new skills, all to, impress or get closer to this person.
So limerence can be like this unexpected push for self-improvement.
In a way, yes. And I think another good thing that can come from it is a better understanding of yourself.
How so?
Going through limerence can force you to confront your own emotional patterns, your attachment style,
Right.
even past traumas.
It's like holding up a mirror to your inner world.
Exactly. It can be painful,
Yeah.
but ultimately valuable.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that limerence is often a symptom of something deeper going on.
That makes sense.
It's not just about this one person you're focused on.
Okay.
It's about what they represent to you.
So maybe it's a chance to take care of those underlying needs.
Yeah.
And build a better life, both for ourselves and in our relationships.
Exactly. It's about shifting our perspective
Okay.
from looking for validation and fulfillment outside of ourselves
Right.
to cultivating those things within.
That makes sense.
It's about self-love, self-compassion, and a strong sense of self-worth.
That sounds like a lot of work, but really freeing. Right.
It is. Imagine the freedom and fulfillment that comes from building relationships grounded in, reality and mutual connection rather than fantasy and projection.
That's a powerful image.
It's about connecting with people who really see you, appreciate you,
Yeah.
and reciprocate your feelings in a healthy, balanced way.
Wow, that's amazing. Like trading in that shaky, unstable foundation for something solid and lasting.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've reached the bottom of this deep dive into limerence.
We
I
have.
hope everyone's come up with a better understanding of this complex emotion.
Me too.
And if you're experiencing it, a feeling of, being able to handle those intense feelings.
Definitely. It's important to remember that you're not alone.
Yeah, that's so true.
Limerence is a common experience, and while it can be tough, it's not forever.
Right.
With self-awareness, compassion, and the right tools, you can move through it
For sure.
and create healthy, fulfilling relationships.
And if this topic resonated with you, I encourage you to check out the resources we've linked to the show notes.
Definitely.
There's a whole world of information out there.
Absolutely. And always remember, you are capable of creating the love and connection you want.
So true.
It all starts with understanding yourself and your needs.
Right.
And building a strong sense of self-worth.
Love that. Until next time, happy diving.
So we were talking about those red flags that can indicate someone might be dealing with limerence.
Yeah, let's get into that.
All right, well, one of the biggest ones is falling for someone incredibly fast and hard,
Okay.
even if you haven't actually had much interaction with them.
Oh, so like those whirlwind romances you see in movies.
Yes, exactly. But even more intense.
Okay, so what else? What are some other things to look out for?
Well, along with that, there's the constant daydreaming about this person. You might find yourself like replaying brief encounters over and over in your head.
Oh, yeah, I've done that.
Or embellishing them.
Right.
Or imagining these whole scenarios that haven't even happened.
So basically, you're living in this fantasy world
Precisely.
instead of actually dealing with what's real.
Yeah. And because you've built up this like idealized image of them, it becomes almost impossible to see any flaws or red flags.
Right. You just like explain them away.
Exactly. You might even find yourself making excuses for their bad behavior or ignoring warning signs.
Ugh, yeah, I've definitely been there.
It's like you're wearing those rose-colored glasses and you refuse to take them off.
Totally. What else is there?
Well, another hallmark of limerence is this intense focus on whether or not they reciprocate your feelings.
Oh.
It's not just about having feelings, it's about that desperate need for them to feel the same way.
Right, like your whole happiness depends on them liking you back.
Exactly. And that can lead to some pretty unhealthy behaviors.
Like what? What kinds of things?
Well, people who are caught in limerence might constantly check the other person's social media,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
try to orchestrate those chance encounters, or like analyze every little interaction for signs of reciprocation.
It's like a constant search for validation.
Exactly. And even more concerning, they might start to believe this person holds the key to their happiness,
Wow.
or that they can somehow solve all their problems.
That's a lot of pressure to put on someone.
It is. And they often do it without even realizing it.
Especially if the other person doesn't feel the same way.
Right, exactly. And speaking of that, our source mentions that people struggling with limerence often find it really hard to move on,
Yeah,
even when it's clear the other person isn't interested.
that makes sense.
They might know on some level that it's not healthy or realistic, but they still feel this overwhelming pull toward the other person.
It's almost like an addiction, right?
Yeah, it's similar to what we were discussing earlier.
So like, what can someone do if they're seeing these signs in themselves?
That's the big question.
Is there even hope for breaking free from this, like, limerence trap?
Absolutely. There is always hope.
Okay, good.
Our source outlines several strategies for overcoming limerence.
Let's hear them.
And as we touched on before, self-awareness is that crucial first step.
You can't fix what you don't acknowledge.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to really look at your life and admit, hey, I'm struggling with this.
Yeah, honesty is key.
Right. And then from there, you can start addressing those root causes we talked about earlier.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, if trauma is a factor, therapies like EMDR or somatic experiencing can be really helpful.
So it's about, like, retraining your brain.
That's a great way to put it. It's about processing and healing from those past experiences so you can respond differently to triggers and emotions.
That's powerful. Now, what about if someone is dealing with insecure attachment?
That's another big one. Working on building secure attachment skills can be super transformative.
Yeah, I've heard about that, but can you give us like a quick overview of what that looks like?
Sure, it often starts with exploring those early attachment experiences that shaped your current relationship patterns.
Oh,
You start to understand how those early experiences might be influencing your behavior today.
I see. So you can break those patterns.
Exactly. And then you can learn new, healthier ways to communicate and connect with others.
That makes a lot of sense.
Ah,
Our source also talks about the importance of challenging your thoughts.
yes. This is key.
But how do you actually do that?
It's about questioning those idealized fantasies you've created around the other person.
Okay.
You have to ask yourself, are these fantasies based in reality?
Right.
Or am I projecting qualities onto them that might not actually be there?
So it's about taking a step back and saying, okay, wait a minute, is this really true or am I getting carried away?
Exactly. And finally, there's emotional regulation.
Okay.
This is so crucial because limerence is such an emotionally intense experience.
Yeah, I could see that. But what does emotional regulation actually look like in practice?
It's about building up your resilience and learning how to handle those intense feelings in a healthy way.
So, like, what kinds of things can people do?
Well, it might involve things like self-care, getting enough sleep, eating a balanced diet, exercising regularly, practicing mindfulness.
Right, all the basics.
Exactly. It's also about having a good support system and learning healthy coping mechanisms for when those tough emotions inevitably come up.
So it's about creating a solid foundation to help you weather those emotional storms.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that limerence isn't a life sentence.
That's good to hear.
With the right tools and support, it's totally possible to move through it and build relationships that are actually grounded in reality.
Right, with mutual respect and connection.
Yes, it's about connecting with people who genuinely see you, appreciate you, and reciprocate your feelings in a healthy and balanced way.
That's beautiful. It's like trading that shaky, unstable foundation of limerence for something much stronger and more lasting.
Exactly. And that's what we all deserve, right?
Absolutely. So before the break, we were talking about the potential upsides of limerence.
Right, the silver linings.
Yeah. Is there ever a time when those intense feelings can actually lead to something good?
Yeah. You know, limerence can be a real tough one,
For sure.
but I think there are some positives.
Like what? What kind of good can come from all that intensity?
Well, for one, it can be seriously motivating, you know?
Okay. How so?
Think about all that energy and focus that goes into, like, chasing after the person you're fixated on.
Right.
It's like you suddenly have all this drive you didn't have before,
Mhm.
and that energy. You can channel it into creative stuff
Oh,
or personal growth, even.
interesting.
You might surprise yourself taking on new challenges,
Yeah.
pushing yourself outside your comfort zone.
So it's like limerence can accidentally make you better yourself.
It can. And another good thing, it can help you understand yourself better, too.
How so?
Going through limerence, it kind of forces you to confront your own emotional patterns,
Right.
your attachment style, maybe even past traumas.
That's deep. It's like limerence is holding up a mirror to all that inner stuff.
Mm. Exactly. It can be tough to look at, though,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
but it's valuable. It's important to remember that limerence is usually a symptom of something bigger, something deeper.
That makes sense.
It's not just about this one person, right?
Okay, so what is it about then?
It's about what that person represents to you, what needs they seem to fulfill.
So maybe it's an opportunity to look at those needs head on
Exactly.
and maybe build a more fulfilling life,
For sure.
both for ourselves and in our relationships.
It's about shifting that perspective, you know?
Okay.
Instead of looking for someone else to validate us, to complete us, we start cultivating those things within ourselves.
Right, like self-love, self-worth, all that.
Exactly. It's a journey, but it's so worth it.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Just imagine the freedom, the fulfillment that comes from building relationships based on reality. Mutual respect, genuine connection.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It's a world away from those shaky foundations of limerence.
Trading those in for something real, something lasting.
Exactly. That's what we all deserve.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of limerence now.
Me too.
And if you're going through it, I hope you feel empowered to work through those intense feelings.
You're not alone in this.
Yeah, that's so important to remember. Limerence is common.
It is.
And it might be tough, but it's not forever.
You can get through this.
With self-awareness, compassion, the right tools.
Absolutely. And you can build those healthy, fulfilling relationships you deserve.
So true. And remember, we've got resources linked in the show notes if you want to dive deeper.
Always happy to provide more info.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Until next time, everyone, happy diving.